Now, why am I bothering with graphing techniques in chemistry lab? Or did I mention it already? I don't know if I did. When you present results of experiments in the lab, there are a number of ways that you can present the information you've obtained from the lab to make your point. You're trying to convince your audience of your position, your interpretation of that data. You can do it in prose, which is pretty boring. You can do it with tables, which is almost as boring, just a series of numbers. Or you can go to the human propensity for visual cues. That's what graphs do. Graphs are better understood by the human brain than any other method. So learning how to draw graphs with your data is absolutely essential for any future presentation of data. Say if you end up, I don't know, end up in a research group and you have to present your data to convince your colleagues for a reviewed paper or for a conference you go to, whatever. Graphing is essential. It's expected. There are a whole host of different types of graphs. Has anybody had graphing in math class? Some types, Cartesian coordinate system, right? X, Y's, histograms. Oh, that's statistics. So if you get into statistics, you'll get those. Okay, we're going to keep it simple here because the type of graphing you're going to need for your formal reports later is simply Cartesian system. So that's where we're headed. Data is a measurement. Anytime you have data, actually is plural. Datum is one. One number is a datum. We usually say data because one number doesn't do you much good. Is a collection of measurements that you get in the lab. And sometimes they're just straight measurements. Sometimes they're associated with some other number, which is likely what we'll get into. So in that case, when you have a sequence of, I better make a change here. In case I'll probably split the video. Lab number 1. Graphing techniques. This is an introduction. If you're proficient with various computer programs, you can get them to graph your data for you. Like Excel has a very limited application, but it can do some decent representations of your data, at least for this class. And there are other types. I used to use a program called SigmaPlot, and it was much more flexible. It would give you publication quality graphs. But whichever one you use, you're going to take that data and it may be a list of numbers, like that. You're going to have a number here, and what's the response? A number here, response. A number here, response. You have a series of numbers. Understanding what they mean before you put them into the graph is essential. Usually, the X values, which go on your Cartesian system, the whole Cartesian system is like that. So this is the x-axis and this is the y-axis. This is called the abscissa. Let's see if I spell it right. Must be further down. Yeah. SCISSA. 3 S's in this thing. Abscissa, and this is the ordinate. Okay. Everything along this line is positive. Along this one is positive. This one's negative. This one's negative. Most of the graphing we do in at least in this class, is going to be in this quadrant here. We may, in fact, one of them, I think, example moves over into this quadrant too. So you have just this part of the graph. We rarely ever go down here. In math class, you probably went all over the place. Like trying to draw a hyperbola. You could have it here and the mirror image would be over here. But for representing data, we have an experiment. And usually what we do is the experimenter controls one of the factors. And the one that the experimenter controls is the X. This is the independent variable. This is the dependent variable. In other words, it depends on what we do over here. So we put the independent values along this axis, and the response is along this axis. And if we go over here so many units this direction, and its response is up here, then the point that we're illustrating is right there. Okay? That's a data point. It represents a measurement. Let's see. Well, okay, this is called the origin, just to be complete. And some graphs go through the origin. Most of them don't. Most of them cross the y-axis somewhere. We call that the y-intercept. And these quadrants, that's what these are, 4 quadrants. So every value up here is positive, positive. Values over here are positive, negative. Okay. And the rest of them, of course, this will be negative, positive, excuse me. Negative, positive, positive here, negative here. And this one would be negative, negative, and this one would be positive, negative. All right, let's see. So we've got representative graphs here. All right. This shows you what I'm expecting to see when you draw a graph. Now, you don't have to put the data on the graph. I mean, that's just to show you the numbers that were used to make the graph. But when you draw the graph, I want to see the X and the Y axes properly drawn. If you need negatives, then you're going to draw this one over far enough to pick up your negatives also. But you have an origin, you have an x-axis, a y-axis, and you're going to put your points in there, however they are, assuming it's a straight line and positive slope, and then you're going to draw a best fit curve. How do you draw a best fit curve? Well, hopefully, if it's a straight line, you just need a ruler. And the best way to draw a best fit line on real data is to have a transparent ruler. So you can see what's on either side of the line. You want to minimize deviations from that line. So this one happens to be pretty straight. But the one that's shown in the graph there, is you have some of them that are above the line, some below the line, one right on the line. You want to minimize the variations. That's the best fit line. Now, if you have actually curved data, then you either have a good eye for drawing best fit, or you get yourself a French curve. Everybody know what a French curve is? It's usually a piece of plastic now. It looks something like this. Right? It has a variable radius so that you can move it around and fit your line to the data points. Now, you may have to draw a best fit line for a few of them and then have to move it again to get it to do. So it's kind of an artwork. Right? Unless you have a computer program that will take your data points and calculate a formula that fits a curve to that. In which case, it'll give you a whole lot of other information too. Okay. But scientists generally prefer to have straight lines when they can get them. And we'll go to extremes to convert our data sets into forms that give us straight lines. We'll talk about those as we go. In fact, I got one coming up in just a minute. In this case, we're comparing temperature and volume of a confined gas. So as the temperature goes up, the volume goes up, and we measured these values. Notice that the data points don't go down all the way to the origin, and they don't go past a certain point. Right? So when we draw this best fit curve between that point and this point, once you have the best fit curve, you can use it to do what ifs. What if, instead of these values here and here and there, I want to say, what if I had a value right here? What could I expect? Right? So you go up here and cross here. That's what I could expect as a response. Okay. When you do it within the points that you've determined by experimentation, that's called interpolation. And that's the safest place to be. If you're forced to go outside that, say you extend the line, and you use that what if on those extended parts, that's called extrapolation. And extrapolation can be dangerous, right? Because we know from statistics that the margin of confidence gets wider and wider the further you get away from your data points. So it could go out like this, or it could go out like that, or somewhere in between. Right? It could go like that or that. We just don't know. Right? So if we have to extrapolate, we try not to go too far from that last data point. Okay, so when you present your data, you're going to have data points on, and you draw an axis, x-axis, y-axis, and you label your axis. In this case, it's temperature in that example. And this is volume. And you also say, what are the units? If you don't know what the units are, then the graph is worthless. In the units here, it's K. Right? It's Celsius, it's essentially, except we're starting with 0. And volume is in liters, I think. Yeah, liters. So those two are essential to label your axes. Then you have to decide, how am I going to divide up those hash marks, those lines, so that I can spread my data out over the available space. Because the wider you can spread it, the finer you can detail when you do your what ifs. So in this case, we're spread over 450K on the x-axis and 1.6 liters maximum on the y-axis. Okay. Now, how do you know to choose those? Well, it depends. I like to choose the values so that I can get 10 divisions between the major marks. Right, so I can work in the decimal range. So in this case, if we go from the origin to 100, there are 10 divisions. Right? Each one of those lines between there is 5 divisions. So if we go 2, we got 10 divisions. 10 divisions would be what? Between 0 and 10 would be 10K every step. So if I were down there, one step below 50 would be 40K. Okay. And you may want to use pencil when you first start to draw your graph so that you can kind of manipulate it. And you can say, all right, I have a data set. If I take so many, if I take units here for so many here, oops, I'm off the end of the paper. So you have to back up and use a different unit that'll bring you within the paper. Okay. You want to get all your numbers spread out as far as possible to give you the easiest way to read your graph. Now, so I've seen graphs turned in on a piece of paper. They were like this. I mean, that's not much use. Okay, what else do you want to do when you position your data on your paper? You want to be sure you've got room for everything and you spread out as far as possible with the available space. You want to know, all right, since we're drawing on sheets of paper, 8.5 by 11, you've got portrait versus landscape, right? So if your X values have the widest range needed, they would go on a landscape orientation on the X-axis. If the Y-axis has the widest range of numbers, then you would rotate it to portrait and put them on the Y-axis. Okay, orientation is important. Of course, you have to label. You don't have to label every tick mark, but you have to label it in such a way that you can read what the tick marks between mean. So in this case, we've got by 50s, 50, 100, 150. That's good. Whoever, I stole this from somebody. Whoever did this graph has some orphan decimals, lots of them. Right? There should be a 0 before each one of those decimals on the Y-axis. I need to edit this and fix that. Okay, so, oh, and one other thing that you got to have. If you draw a graph like this and have all that information on it, I may not know what it means. Even if you've got the axes properly labeled, I still don't know what it refers to. You need a title. Tell me what this data is supposed to do, what it's supposed to say. It's supposed to say the comparison of a volume of oxygen with variable temperature. That title is absolutely important. It's essential. If I ever try to publish a research paper without a title on my graph, that's the first thing the reviewer would say. Big X, send it back to me. Okay. So some definitions, right? We have sample, let's see. I got some extras here if you need extra paper. This is the grid. Just the lines drawn on the paper. That's the grid. The scale units are the values that you apply to each one of those grid marks. Right. So when we label our X-axis, we're applying the scale units. The data point we already talked about, that's an XY data point. Now you don't have to, you can. You can write in what X1, 2, 3 and Y3. You can write them in like that if you want to. You don't have to. Should be able to read them off the graph easily enough. We talked about drawing a best fit curve, either a straight line or a smooth curve. Relationships, proportionalities. If as X increases, Y increases, that's a direct proportion or a direct relationship. And it's also shown in straight line as a positive slope. Okay. If you get the line turned the other way like this, then as X increases, Y decreases. That's an inverse relationship. It will have a negative slope. Okay. Let's make some room up here. I'm going to change some things. And let's see, change that, change this also. And that's always the case. That slope determines whether it's a direct or inverse relationship. Let's see. That talks about selecting scale units, plotting your points, best fit curves, tilting a graph, that's orientation, basically. Interpolating, extrapolating, we talked about that already. Calculating the slope of a straight line. Okay. Everybody should recognize this one. Y equals mx plus b. Right? X variable, Y variable, slope, Y intercept. That's characteristic of all straight lines. That slope, say we do have a positive slope like this. Okay. Our best fit curve And say, just for argument's sake, our best fit curve actually intercepts those 2 points. That would be great. Because then all we have to do is take the data from this and determine rise over run. The increase in y divided by the increase in x. That's your slope. Okay. For every unit of this one, every unit of that one, you get so many units of this one. So that's how you calculate slope. You would take the final value minus the initial value for y. So we would say y final minus y initial over x final minus x initial. And these finals are on the same point. You don't get to jump around and pick which ones you want. You've got an xy, an xf, and a yf, and an xi and a yi points. Those are the values that you input here to give you your slope for a straight line. Okay. There's a couple of examples. Let's see. And equally as important is, what are the values? What are the units of measure for the x and the y? So if, let's see. Let's go back. If we have, let's say just for argument's sake, we have K for temperature here and liters for the volume. Then the difference in Y will be in liters. And the difference in X will be K. So whatever number comes out of this one, right here, will have units of liters per K. Remember, everything you do to the numbers, you do to the units. Okay. And when it gives you L to the -1, that's in the denominator. Right? Anytime you put a -1 over a unit next to a unit, you're saying it's in the denominator. It's like 1 divided by that. Okay, that's what -1 means. Inverse proportion, we talked about that already. Let's see. Okay, so here we have a comparison of when we change the pressure on a confined gas, what happens to the volume? You probably know intuitively that if you squeeze a gas, it's going to decrease the volume. Increase the pressure, decrease the volume. That's an inverse relationship. As we increase the pressure, the volume decreases. The thing about it is, though, that this is reality. And the real world doesn't necessarily like straight lines. In this case, when we have the pressure at, in this case, what is it, atmospheres, and the volume is probably in liters, the response is not going to be a straight line. It's going to be a curve. All right, and this is a special kind of curve. This is the hyperbola. This is one part of the hyperbola. In the real world, we're positive, positive. Right? In the mathematical world, you could have another mirror over here. But as the pressure increases, the volume decreases. But it's due to the fact that when we say pressure times volume, we always get a constant value. There, I just gave you Boyle's law. That's why we get this curve. And it never touches the axes. What would happen if pressure or volume, either one, went to 0? Like volume went to 0 or pressure went to 0 up here. You don't have a formula anymore, right? 0 times that is 0. So we don't have our K anymore. So that's why this is a hyperbola. These tails never touch the axis. They go on to infinity. That's a hyperbola. In the real world, right? Not mathematically, they've got formulas for it. Okay, so how do we say that this is an inverse relationship? Where's the negative slope? Well, the negative slope is constantly changing, but it's always negative. And we talk about the negative slope in terms of its tangent. the straight line tangent to any point on that curve. Say here, it would go like that. But if we were down here, it would go like that. But it's always negative. It's just not constant. So the slope varies on this curve. And that's a problem for doing calculations. You can still read the graph, right? You can say, at this pressure, I didn't make the measurement, but at this pressure, I could get that volume. Okay, that works. And we build the graph the same way, right? We choose its orientation. We label axes so that we can spread our data out as far as possible. We have uniform divisions between them so that it's easy to read. And we have the least amount of unused space as possible. And we have a title. Now, turns out that we can make a straight line out of that data. If we have, let's go over here. Pressure is the independent one. Yeah. Pressure is independent and volume is dependent. Volume is response to what we do to pressure. Okay, so we get this series of data points, and we know that they're going to be P times V equals a constant. All right, I want to make a straight line out of that information. Can I do it? Well, I wouldn't be talking about it if I couldn't do it. We're going to do some mathematical manipulations. How do we get this form into a straight line? Right now, it's not a straight line. It's not y equals mx plus b. These are our variables. What if we divide both sides by the same value? V. We can do that. The math teacher says I can do that. Okay, that cancels this one and leaves me with P equals K over V. Well, I can factor out the variable also. So I'm going to factor this variable out. What is it? Well, the factored variable is K is in the numerator like it is here. And 1 over V is what's left over. Okay. So far, so good. Okay. This is my X variable. Let's see. Now, this is my X variable. This is my Y variable. But for purposes of argument, we can trade places with them for graphing purposes. We could put 1 over V on the Y-axis. And P, well, yeah, we just keep it that way. I don't know why I was spreading over that. It works out just fine. So, well, I should have left that there. This one didn't change, atmospheres. But if we do a transformation of the data, and we say we take all these and do the inverse of each one of those, right? Y to the minus 1. Or volume to the minus 1. Now we've got transformed data. And if we plot pressure against 1 over V, liters to the minus 1, we can get a straight line. Now we know it goes through the origin because there's no B there. It's a 0. So that means it has to go through the origin. And that's what we're showing in the next, right here. That transformation gives us a straight line. Now, how do we use that to do our what ifs? Well, if we say the pressure, we change the pressure, say, right here, right there, and then there, this would be 1 over V. That value is 1 over V. All we have to do now is take the inverse of that, and that'll give us V. So if we want to do pressure volume what ifs, we do pressure to 1 over volume, and then we convert it back to volume. And that tells us what the volume would be at that pressure using a straight line. Okay. So I think the graphs you're going to draw are temperature and volume, pressure volume, and pressure 1 over volume. I think those three are required in this exercise. And then there's a section in the back that's extra credit, bonus section. And you can do those too. You can just answer some of the questions, or you can draw the graphs. You can get lots of points on this one if you want to spend the time doing those bonus sections. But they're not required. That goes a little too deep for our discussion, but if you feel up to it, confident to do it, go right ahead. Let's see. Right, we're getting into discussion here. Titration curve is another, that's part of that extra credit business. I don't think we're going to do any titrations in our labs. Oh, yeah, we are. Yeah, I guess we are. We're going to do one. Lab exercise 6 is a titration. So I'll talk about more. I'll talk titrations more later. There are different types of titrations. You can do an acid-base titration. Oh, the sky's the limit. And I'll take time to explain that later when we get to that point. But if you tackle the extra credits, the bonus, then you're going to introduce yourself to titrations, and you're going to have to read up on it to understand what they mean. Okay, got a few more minutes. Let's see if I missed anything. Okay. Most of our curves, here's a titration curve. Look at the shape. That's known as a sigmoid because it looks like an S, right? You see that in biology a lot in growth curves for populations. They start off really slow. Over time, they increase in population. Then all of a sudden they go like that. And they get so numerous that they exhaust their food supply, and then they level off. So this is a chemistry titration curve. The other sigmoid I was describing is a growth curve. Okay, you can read about that if you want. This is another type. It's called a broken curve. The best way to approach this one is to break your data apart into, in this case, 2 manageable pieces. So you get a straight line at the bottom with those points, and then all of a sudden you get a change in temperature that goes up and starts another line. Let's see. And there's some questions here to answer. You can get 78 points required. You get 39 points bonus. So you can really clean up if you pay attention. And don't forget the units. Right? Any measurement that comes from your graph must have units of some kind. If you're using a what if, then maybe it's only got 1 unit for like the y-axis or the x-axis. If you're talking about a slope, it'll have a compound unit, something divided by something else. Okay. So don't forget those units. You forced me to count off for them. Don't make me do that. It takes too much time. I like papers where I can just go in and check. Oh boy. Those are the kind of papers that I want to grade and that you want to get. Let's see. Let's see. We're still in the required section here. This pressure volume, and then we're going to make a transformation and draw the graph. So you have 3 required graphs, and then there are a couple other graphs that you can do in the bonus section if you want to do them. Okay. Any questions? I think I covered all the points.